Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, Brian Bales, and we're in this fourth week called Retuning.
It is. So we started with the big idea, so to speak, in week one, and then the last 3 weeks, we have been fleshing out how to make that happen a little bit better. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, full confession. We used to do these Wednesday afternoon when both of us felt more alert and awake. Mm-hmm. We've now shifted to Thursday mornings first thing when we are less so in both categories.
Yes, but by first thing, it just means it's not like, at least for me, I haven't had a significant amount of coffee already.
Yeah.
Anytime that you get me that switch from the coffee to the water, then I'm ready.
It's late enough.
I'm ready as I'm going to be.
Yeah, it's not like 6 a.m. or anything. We're not crazy. At any rate, so as we often do, we'll do a quick recap of the Sunday service, but that is not the permission to skip the Sunday service. Nope. It's just recognition that in some cases, some of you are catching this days, weeks, months, or even years after the fact. Mm-hmm. So a little context is helpful. So Brian, if you want to give us the quick summation.
Yeah, so the third point that we try to be or focus in and what it means to be indispensable is this statement that we're making that we are better together. Mm-hmm. And I spent some significant time at the beginning of our time on Together Sunday saying, to my knowledge, you won't find any place in Scripture that commands us to be together. Mm-hmm. And so we might think that's an out. Well, no, it's not an out because you didn't have to command to be in community in the ancient world. It was a necessity to live. So Jesus' focus over and over again is not to tell you about something that's a necessity. It's about how to live out well that thing that's a necessity. Mm-hmm. And so we had to spend some time, especially in our individualized American view. It's like, no, we've got to be in community first. So we spent some time there. And then we talked about, what does it look like? And we handed out a paper. And I hope that if you came on Sunday, you've got it online. We're going to talk more about that actually in the new year, 2024, talk about what it means to be known, to show your story and your story to be grown. We didn't have time for that because it's more of an overview sort of talk. Mm-hmm. And that we need to live out of love. And I didn't say this on Sunday. I've been saving this for the podcast.
Okay.
It's a little hidden Easter egg in what I did on Sunday. I don't know that if you noticed, but I gave a shout out in my sermon to Vanilla Ice. Did you catch that?
I did. I loved it.
Did you catch that? So, in fact, when we got to the end, and I thought about doing it, and also, by the way, just full disclosure, we're recording this before I speak on Sunday, so I might talk myself into doing this in the sermon. I don't know, but
it's going to be hard to hold this back.
The 3 steps, I could actually, if it wasn't seeming unspiritual, call them the Vanilla Ice principles of living in community. Yeah, you got to stop, you got to pause, you need to understand that collaboration is there, and you got to listen. Mm-hmm. Not to others, but to listen to God in that way. But I just felt off calling the Vanilla Ice principles of what we're talking about in Scripture. But I did find it interesting that there was some connection there.
Yeah, I mean, that would just create a gigantic squirrel moment for so many people. But it would be so good.
It would be. So if you're having trouble after listening to Sunday, thinking about the 3 steps that we've talked about.
Never going to forget it.
It's the Vanilla Ice principles. If we want to be in community, first off, we have to be willing to stop and pause all these other things. We need to understand that collaboration, connection is necessary. Mm-hmm. And then the third part, and this is sometimes when we get to the first 2, the third one, ask God. Listen, right? We talk about this very early in the podcast. We've got to ask God, but we'll say that again and again and again.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it was funny. I was looking at the notes to make the podcast notes, and my wife, Brooke, was in the other room, and I came across that, and I had this moment of tension of, do I tell her, or do I let her discover it for herself?
Did you tell her?
No, I opted for the wait and see approach. But just so you know,
in my notes, I put them in italics, so when you read them, it would pop out just a little bit. Just a little bit.
Yep. And also, that's fair, because I'm usually the one putting earworms in your head.
Well,
so it was nice to have that running in my head.
So, the podcast is how to take our faith forward, but we do squirrel moments every once in a while. We do. Let me actually give you an amazing way how God works. Mm-hmm. I kid you not. We talk about how God's voice speaks to us in very unique ways, and God knows our language, right? And I don't mean this in any way, shape, or form to make it sound like God doesn't have high theology.
Sure.
But he knows how this person works, and it's a lot through my culture growing up in the 80s. And so I was at my local coffee shop, I don't know, a week and a half ago, and it was 7:30 in the morning, and I kid you not, Ice Baby comes on in the coffee shop. And so I just randomly go, at your local coffee shop, put them on social media. At 7:30 a.m., they play Ice Baby. It's either going to be the best day ever or the worst day ever. You're not sure at that point. So I put it on there. And so I put it on, and I kid you not, one of the people who go to Christian Fellowship Church, if you go to my social media feed, you'll see who they are, but I'll leave them nameless here. They said to me, I dare you to work that into a sermon. I dare you to work a sermon. And I've been known from time to time to take those dares, not because it's about the scripture first and foremost, but just needs to. But I kid you not, Jesus stopped and said, that I had you know that because there's some specific things about stop, collaborate, and listen that actually are really significant scripturally about this. And I thought, holy cow, God, you even speak through Vanilla Ice, which might be up there right behind turning water into wine and sort of miracles levels if you can speak through Vanilla Ice.
Divinely inspired. Who knew?
It's something like that. That is a squirrel moment. But yeah, nonetheless. So here we go.
So as we work our way through this, we'll see how many other side trails we discover along the way. Got to keep it fun. But as always, the goal is to make this practical. And so we've got a few things here that may prove helpful. They're incredibly uncomfortable for us as we've just been looking at them in preparation. Because as you said right before we hit record, there's some of these that we don't feel like we have good answers for yet, that we're still very much in process. And we may understand principles.
Yep.
We may understand that this is the right thing to do and this is the not right thing to do, but I still don't necessarily do it well.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned on Sunday, this is of the three things that we've talked about, to be giveaway people, partners, not participants, and better together. This is the one I struggle with personally most, not theologically.
Yeah.
And the point isn't, again, we say this all the time, isn't to know theology.
No.
It's to live this truth. And so this is the one personally I struggle with the most.
Yeah. So welcome to our discomfort.
Yep.
And with that, so one of the things you mentioned on Sunday, probably, is we need to stay connected to Jesus in that relationship that we've been invited into, that we're trying to maintain, that we're trying to develop. We need to stay connected to Jesus in that relationship if we're to have any chance of living and loving well in that relationship.
Right.
One of the things that I just happened to see on my social media feed today, which is interesting because my social media feed is a whole lot of like trades work, carpentry, drywall, tractor repair, things like that. And then there's like spiritual stuff too. It's an interesting mix. But this line came up today, which was equipping people to love like Jesus requires the same level of energy for equipping them to love God. And it felt like that's a lot of what we're talking about here, that this isn't just the command to go and love people to the best of your ability out of your own ability.
Yeah.
That the progression that you laid out in John 15 is there is the necessity to first and foremost be deeply, inextricably, and in an ongoing way connected to God in a moment-by-moment way so that everything else is possible. It's not a going away and coming back. It's a maintaining that connection so that you can have these other connections. And that may be the first practical place to stop and listen and collaborate with God in doing so. But to ask the question, God, am I trying to do community without you?
Yeah, when I was studying John chapter 15, it was one of those aha moments that I don't necessarily know why it hadn't really dawned on me before, because it wasn't like the first time I've ever spent time in John chapter 15. At the minimum, I could go back to the seminary classes called The Gospel of John, a lot of time in John, to see that progression. And I think it's really clear when he talks about John 15, I'm the vine, you're the branches. If you abide in me, you live. And when we are going to think about what it looks like to love others the way Jesus loved them, the types of calls that he says, love one another, be willing to lay down your life for them. And again, I think, we'll probably talk about this a little bit later on, none of us are going to be asked to do that, but we will be asked over and over again to sacrifice, and that's the principle behind it. Well, maybe someone will be asked, but very highly unlikely. What does it look like? That there's no possible way that we can accomplish what loving others well without coming from his strength and power. And so maybe a good practical first step, if you are like me in this way, you will see a relational connection, in my opinion, between how well you're abiding in Jesus and your willingness and ability to live well together in community. The deeper I abide with Jesus, the stuff that gets in my way, the more I'm going to be like, okay, this bothers me. This invites me into fear. This invites me into anger or whatever it might be. Notice I said invite. Doesn't do it. I have the choice with the power of the Holy Spirit. It invites me into that. But the more I have a relationship with Jesus, I'm like, okay, but I know that he's asked me to do this, and he doesn't ask me to do anything that's in my wrong interest. He doesn't ask me to do this. It's not good. Doesn't mean it's not hard. But the more that I'm secure in that. And so if you struggle with being together, might I first say, before you go out and start trying to be together, how are you with Jesus?
Yeah.
And we talk about this in this podcast many times. We've talked about it on Sundays as well, is that there are lies that we believe that seem very true. There are lies that we believe about ourselves, there are lies that we believe about the world or others, and there are lies that we believe about God. And I just have to come down to this conclusion. If I refuse to be in community, to be better together, that means that there's something I believe about God that isn't true. Yeah. Not the least of which may be, I don't think he has my best interest in mind.
Yeah.
And so if by nature you're listening to this and you're saying, I can't do this. And by the way, this is not an introvert-extrovert discussion. You can be in community, either one.
Yep.
Right? You can be known, shown, and grown in that environment no matter what. These are two introverts, right? It's not about that. Like, I just like my time by myself. Not at all. That's where it starts, I think. Where do we really do that? And then this idea of, as I abide with him, asking him, okay, God, how do I do this? Where do you give me guidance? Because left, especially in some difficult scenarios, I mean, we've talked about, mercy, patience, forgiveness, guidance. We need help navigating each of those in relationships. Every relationship is different.
Yeah.
There's no cookie cutter like, well, this is how I navigate those with my family that is my family of origin, and this is how I navigate them with my church family, or this is how I navigate them with my spouse, or if you happen to have children, this is how I navigate, with my children, or whatever it might be. We need to do that, and we first got to have, to the best that we can, our relationship in a good place with him.
Yeah.
Because if we just, and this is a side note, but I think if we accidentally or on purpose go to him first, like, tell me how to do this before I spend time with him, we're misunderstanding really what he wants in that way. And we're accidentally, even in a good way, becoming transactional instead of transformational.
Yeah,
So.
That's exactly what that was making me think of, was all the time that we spent this year and last year talking about the difference between being transactional with God and transformational. And if the goal, as we've talked about community, and as we laid it out in this paper that we gave to the congregation, if the goal is transformational community, transformational relationships, you can't get that by being transactional with God.
No.
The math doesn't work on that. And so you do have to be willing to engage in a transformational relationship with God to have transformational community. There has to be a level of being known that you allow, that you accept in your relationship with God. He already knows you, but you have to be willing to let some of those things that he already knows about you become something that you're aware of.
Yeah, I think when I was reading your notes, that's a little bit of where my mind went when we talked about laying down our life, like going to and I can't think of a time, I'm sure I have, but I can't think of a time recently where I've walked in knowing I have an agenda with God. But I can think of times where God's like, yeah, hey, thanks for your time here. You want to talk about this? We're going to put that aside. Am I willing to put aside my agenda? Am I willing to lay down my desires, my preferences, my rights? And do what he asked. And one of the tensions, and I don't know if we'll get to this later on, but just sort of came to my mind, is that sometimes when I go to God, I become very transactional from the standpoint of not just I want to hear what it is you have to say, I want to know the whys and the hows. And especially when it comes to this idea that if I go to God and I'm abiding with him and he's again drawing me and calling me farther into deeper and better community in my life, there have been clear times in my life where I felt like God said, okay, this person, this group of people, And I'm like, you're going to have to tell me why
Yeah.
or what. And I didn't say it that way, but his step in that way, okay, you've been in this relationship. Do you trust me? I'm going to reveal all of this because my fear comes out. Like, if you don't tell me all the reasons that this is a person I should do this with, or this, all this other stuff's going to come in. It's like, no, I'm your reason. You know, I love you. And again, because I've said this one's probably the most difficult, challenging, personal, whatever term you want to use, I will probably be a little more anecdotal and all over the place today than I normally am.
Sure. And one of the things that I've found helpful, and I've had, you know, as we've spent time offering classes where we help people learn how to better connect with and hear from God, and as I spent time in one-on-one settings with folks, you know, one of the questions they often ask is, well, what happens if I'm not hearing him? What happens if I'm asking him to show me the what, to show me the why, to show me the who, and I'm not hearing him? And I've had to go through my own journey of, all right, God, I'm trying to do the thing I think you want me to do, and I'm not getting any direction. So am I just supposed to go figure it out? And the thing that I've learned over the years and has proven helpful in helping others is, if I'm coming to God with my agenda, even if it's a good agenda of, God, I need to know what to do about this, this, and this, what to do, where to go, who to help, et cetera, and I'm not getting anything, I've just started asking him a new question, which is, God, what do you want to talk about? And the heart behind that question is the recognition, I'm trying to talk about things out here, and what he may be wanting to talk about are things in here. And if you're just catching the audio, those are hands pointing out versus hands pointing in. And I kid you not, 95% of the time, when I'm not getting anything about what to do and where to go and who and how and all that, and I shift the question to, all right, God, what in me do you want to talk about? 95% of the time he says, your heart. Which is the gateway into conversation about the things I'm believing about myself, the things I'm believing about him, the things I'm believing about this life. And inevitably, he takes that conversation about me and him and my heart, and we eventually get around to most of the things I was asking about what to do and where to go and how. But it's the very practical, for me, illustration of we have to stay connected to him first. Before we can truly be connected with others. And I so often am coming with a transactional mindset, though well-intentioned, of, God, I'm trying to do the things that you asked me. And what gets revealed so often is, yeah, but you're not trying to do them with me. You're trying to do them for me.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that ad nauseum here, so no need to beat that drum too much. But some of the things that we do have to lay down, our way. Right? It doesn't always get right. I don't get to just go to the God of the universe and say, I want answers to these questions at this time in ways that I understand and mostly, hopefully, like. My right, like the number of times that I haven't wanted to engage with people, and that doesn't mean they become my best friends and we invite them over for Christmas, but that there is a level of connection that God's inviting me into. And in most cases, it's more for my benefit than I realize. I often think of it as, well, I'm connecting with them for their benefit. No, it's as much for my benefit, if not more, than I first realized. And I have to be willing to lay down my right to decide who's worth my time and who's not, who adds value to my life and who doesn't. And if any of that sounds arrogant or prideful, I'm sorry. Because as like most people, pride is something that God is still working on me and that I think I know. I think I know who I am. I think I know who they are. I think I know what God's doing. That's all pride. And if we're not connected to him and he's not showing us what's actually true, what's actually real, what he's actually inviting us into, we'll miss it, and we'll insist on clinging to our discernment, our perception, our interpretation of what's real, and we'll miss it. We'll miss the good. And that was the question that you asked people was, what if we're missing out on something greater? And so often that's the case. So often we accept something less. We determinedly accept something less. We pridefully accept something less than what God's offering us. And no, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. The thought is that one of the things I think in my life, and as I've had the chance to spend time with other people, is when we've not experienced it, we believe it's not true.
Yeah.
Right? And God is an unlying God. And so when I opened up this reality that I had asked a question on Sunday, and I will ask the question, what if I'm wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's just be truthful. Most of us are open to the conceptual thought that we're wrong.
Yeah.
But when our experiences and our emotions and all of those sort of things tend to say a different story, we're sort of open to this idea of what I'm wrong, but not really.
Yeah.
And so if you're hearing this and like, well, this sounds great, but I've never experienced that, that doesn't actually change the reality of the truth he wants us to live from. And so, you know, we are missing something out on something. It doesn't mean it's not going to be hard. It doesn't mean it's not going to be challenging. I had this moment, I wish I could have gotten this on Sunday, and I know I couldn't. It's like, Jesus modeled this. He lived with 12 men. Okay. If you go through those 12 men and what we know about them, there had to be nothing about that relationship that Jesus had living day in and day out with those 12 that by nature said, oh, this is going to be easy.
Yeah.
I mean, not the greatest example is two of his disciples. Simon was a zealot, which meant he wanted to kill all traitors to the Jewish nation. Levi/Matthew was a traitor to the Jewish nation who came to know Jesus because he was a tax collector. That's two extremes. You know, Jesus, and here's the thing, Jesus knew everybody's junk too. I mean, like sometimes we get in a relationship and we don't even know what we're getting into. Like, oh, and then we discover some of the hardness. He knew all of that. And so, but he even modeled that for us, right? He modeled his life. And I know for some people like, oh, did Jesus need people? Yes. Not to be God, right? He didn't need people to be God. And let me be very, very clear about that. He is sufficient in and of himself. But relationally, his need comes from what he wants to model what we did. He's the second Adam, is what Scripture says. That means so as he lived here in his humanity, he modeled for us how we. So in that answer, he needed to live in community to model for us how we need to live. Otherwise, we would go, Jesus didn't do it. And we're supposed to do everything Jesus did. Right? That's what Scripture says, right? Be perfect as I am. If you understand that, be complete, not necessarily perfect. So anyway, again, another scroll moment.
No, that's all good. And so we don't get the out because Jesus didn't do it. But I think sometimes we take another out because as human beings, we're often people of extremes. Right? I'm so much more comfortable with all or nothing, black or white, 1 or 0. Right? The middle is so hard. And it really makes me appreciate when Jesus talks about the narrow way. And I think sometimes we look at the narrow way as it must be like tightrope walking or walking the razor's edge, or right that it's impossible. And it's not. I really feel like the narrow way is more like a sidewalk. It's just not an 8-lane road, but you can walk comfortably on a sidewalk. And a sidewalk is narrow by comparison. But this isn't necessarily a tightrope, but it does require intentionality because, as I'm sure you've seen in reality or on YouTube, if you're staring at your phone and not looking at where you're going, a whole sidewalk suddenly becomes very narrow and you're falling into people's landscaping and running into other people and things like that. And so when we're talking about laying your life down, needing to be sacrificial, needing to stay connected to Jesus in order to stay connected to different relationships in the way that's appropriate, again, if we're trying to do it on our own, out of our own thinking, out of our own assumptions of what's right and what's wrong, my way leads to disaster as easily as any way does. But in between is this narrow way. But you see the overfunctioning, right? All right, so in my relationship with a spouse or with children, I am always going to sacrifice myself and always give them what I think they need or what I think they want, and I'm always going to put myself last. That's not helpful, and that's a recipe for disaster. Just as it's unhelpful to my needs need to come first. I need to take care of myself, and so I am not going to drive my kids around to umpteen different things. I am going to dictate that we stay home because that's what's in the best interest of me.
Yeah.
I am always going to pick what we're going to watch so that we never spend 30 minutes trying to figure out what to watch on Netflix. My way.
Currently at our house, Gilmore Girls. I do not have a choice in that, for the record.
Insisting on my way leads to disaster as often as insisting on any way or anyone else's way. There is a narrow way. Well, how do you walk that way? You need guidance. That's why you have to stay connected, because I'm guessing, all experienced the reality of, well, I tried to do what I thought was best for them and it didn't work. Well, I tried to do what I thought was best for me and I hurt their feelings, right? How do we navigate that? You need guidance. You can't treat your spouse the same as your parents, the same as your kids, the same as your friends, the same as that friend versus that friend, the same as your coworkers. Yeah. And yet all of those are relationships that we are invited into because there's something to be experienced for us there, not just as a place to go and serve to make their lives better. Which leads us to some things that we need to become honest about if we're going to move forward in this. And I know we're not exactly looking forward to this next part, but here we go.
Mm-hmm. All right, here we go. So moving forward, there's like some categories where we have to be honest. Mm-hmm. I want to first say there's a chance that we might not know how to be honest. And it's not because we're fighting against honesty, that there's some things that just God needs to reveal in us.
Yeah.
But a lot of this, we kind of already know. And so one of the first is that if we're going to take our faith forward, especially in going deeper in community, Jon, that you've talked about here, is being honest about the past hurts and the effect of past hurts. Mm-hmm. I think there's like two sort of extremes that often happen with that. The first one is what I always jokingly call the dark night in front of the bridge in Monty Python.
Right.
If you've ever seen that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not worth Googling. But the long story short is that a guy's trying to pass, he's guarding at the dark night, and in a very hilarious sort of slapstick way, he loses both his arms, both his legs. He's a stump, still talking. And he's like, I'm fine. It's but a flesh wound. I've had worse. That's called denial.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of people who've been legitimately injured, intentionally and unintentionally, in community that like, oh, I'm fine.
Yeah.
I've had worse. Well, we need to let God come in and speak to us in that moment. So we've got to be honest. And then I think there are people who are then, they're like, I'm fine, honest. But then there are people who go to the other extreme, and yes, they've been hurt, but also it's not necessarily hurt. It's just hard. And so they translate hard. They have flashbacks. They have all of that. You know, here's me, for example. I know there's some long-term life relationships that I have that I struggle with. And sometimes when I'm meeting new people and they haven't done anything, but if all of a sudden they have like a shadow of what I feel like my experience was with these other people, immediately I'm like, oh, can't do that.
Right.
I can't do that.
Right.
And without even trying, I begin to impose upon them something that isn't necessarily true, but even if it was true, doesn't mean God doesn't want me to step into it. I mean, there's a whole lot of extremes in that way. So we've got to be honest, because it results in a couple things. One of the things that we talk about in the Encounter Conference, in fact, so a little plug for if you're listening to this, it's coming up on the weekend of Friday night, October the 13th, and Saturday, October the 14th of 2023, in case you're listening to this later on.
And time traveling's not possible yet.
Exactly. Is about rejection. And so I think we oftentimes don't have community because we're not someone who invites it by our very actions.
Yeah.
And so by that I mean that, one, we come very prickly and standoffish so people don't invite us, or we try to start and we've got that fear in us, and so we wind up creating the very thing that we don't want. Like, I don't want someone to hurt me, so I'm going to act like you can't hurt me.
Right.
And then as a result, you really don't want to spend a lot of time with me. And so guess what? You walk away. And I'm like, see, I told you, everyone walks away. Yeah. There's a term for that. It's called pre-rejection. I will live in such a way, knowingly or unknowingly, that this, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And a lot of the reasons we do that, outside of the unbiblical reasons we do that, is because we become used to being able to handle a certain level of pain in relationships. But beyond that threshold, whoa.
Yeah.
I can't.
Yep.
I can't.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's one of them in that. So you've got to be open to that. And so it does, I think, for me, wind up like I avoid certain types of people. And some of you are like, well, what type of people do you avoid, Pastor Brian? I want to be really, really clear. I'm not going to say the type of people that I avoid, because it's not you, it's me.
Yeah.
It's not you. I mean, you may have your stuff, but it's me.
Yeah.
Right? Who God made you to be is who God made you to be. But I do have a very distinct group of people in my mind who God has made that, in my experience, I have had more relational hurt from than others.
Yep.
That doesn't make them wrong. That doesn't certainly make me right. it makes in those moments, I can feel it when I get around that. I'm like, what's going on in me? And so if they invite me into something deeper, I have a higher level, and I've got to go to God. Say, God, what are you asking me in this? Not what am I seeing from my past hurts? What am I seeing from my past problems? And I'm imposing back to that shadow sort of idea. And will I be willing? So for me, again, not to make this all about me, but if Jon happened to be that type of person, how it could play out for me is, and he's not, by the way, and even if he was, that's not his fault, that's mine. I would first avoid it, but then if that next step, I'd be like, all right, God, I know I'm supposed to do it, but I would knowingly, lots of times, and sometimes unknowingly, only allow it to get so far. And I know that happens, and Jon's good at asking very deep, probing questions. And over the years, I've just said, I'm just going to deflect that one right now. And when I say that, it's not because, first off, I know I can't deflect with Jon because he'll see it a mile away, but also because I recognize I'm not ready to talk about it, but I need to say I'm not ready to talk about it, or that, which is actually a way of being vulnerable in some ways. And so, we just got to be honest about our past hurts. Don't act like it's a Dark Knight scenario. Don't like every scenario has been horrible. And say, God, what do you want me to do? Don't have me avoid certain types of people, or a particular depth of relationships.
Yeah. And, for my part, some of this comes because of significant personal hurts in specific personal relationships. Some of this we just cultivate because of life experiences in general. And so part of my life experience was, as a kid, I moved around a lot, or my parents moved around a lot, and they brought me with them to each new spot, which was ultimately a good thing. But that meant that I grew accustomed to not having long-term relationships. I grew accustomed to not having the time to cultivate deeper relationships. And so part of my normal just became surface relationships that I never necessarily realized were as surface as they were, because I had never experienced the true depth of community and relationships that are cultivated over years.
I love that you bring that up, because I think we live in a very transit area, and jobs move people. I had the same experience growing up, different, family scenario, but same moving around. And that could be a way to analyze how to take your faith forward. Sometimes we don't have deeper relationships just simply because we've never been around a place long enough to know what it looks like to have a relationship longer than 3 years. Longer than 2 years, or whatever it might be. And so if you find yourself stuck, maybe that's one of the questions, God, maybe this isn't me actively doing something. Maybe I just have never been here before. And God, give me the opportunity in year 4, or for me, year 12, or whatever year it might be.
And I've also had to take a look at the kinds of people that I would naturally not want to move towards and connect with. And for part of my life, that was church people. And it wasn't because of a significant, particular wounding moment. It was more just lack of interest. I tried the church thing for a little while. I found nothing worthwhile in it. And so that just made me feel like church people aren't going to be my people, because there's other things that I find more worthwhile. And so I intentionally avoided people, not because I thought they were bad, not because I thought they were evil, not because I was convinced they were going to hurt me, just because I didn't feel interested. But that clouded my judgment. That gave me that false sense of discernment that we were talking about earlier, that made me feel like I can correctly gauge the people I should and should not interact with. And God's funny, because for the first 20 some odd years of my life, when I was largely disinterested in church, the people that I kept developing friendships with, in spite of my best efforts in some cases, were people with a strong faith. It was like I couldn't get away from them, because God's funny. And he is always willing to take us to places where our fundamental preconceptions are challenged. And so this is part of what we're saying. Be honest, which may require God showing you about the past hurts. Singular painful moments, but also just lifestyle frames of mind and perspectives that have been cultivated in some cases without being noticed. And the second thing that we have to be honest about goes really hand in glove with the first, that if we're going to be honest about the past hurts and the effects of those past hurts, we also have to be honest about how we contributed to those situations. And so one of the things that I had to realize was my life experience was moving around a lot. My contribution to that was cultivating a self-protection policy of, I'm not going to need people because I'm tired of saying goodbye to them. Mm-hmm. I'm tired of moving closer, getting connected, getting emotionally engaged, and then having to say goodbye again and again and again. So to protect myself from future pain, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to stop needing people. I'm going to stop inviting people in at that level. And I didn't know I did that to the depth that I do it until I was 35, sitting in a men's retreat out in Colorado, and I heard two really close friends, get up on a stage and share the story of the one telling the other, it's really hard to be your friend because you don't need anything from anyone. And so where do I fit in your life? And it was like I just got hit head on by a 60-mile-an-hour semi. Like I suddenly saw my life differently than I'd ever seen it before. I'd always sort of taken pride in the fact that I don't need anybody, that if push comes to shove and I have to go solo, I can go solo because I know how to do that. And I'm suddenly having to be confronted with my part of all the relationships that never got deeper.
Can I ask this question? Because I've said this, right? And looking back, I don't think it's a very smart thing. I don't need you, but I want you. Isn't that great? Yeah. And so if you have this thought process that you think, oh, great, I don't need anyone, but I want you, so you should feel, that's a little bit like saying you're a spare tire in my life. Like you're only there in case of emergencies. I really don't need you, but I want you there to feel secure. Nobody relationally wants to feel like the spare tire. Everyone, and again, we talked about this in a class recently. I was here on a Wednesday night. When we hear the word need, if immediately inside of you hear the word need and think needy, there's a problem. Because there are innate, wired things that God has made us to need, and community is one of them. And if by nature we've taken the term needy and made it need and made it needy, there's a problem. Much like we've talked before, if we take humble and think it's humiliating, it's a problem, right? They aren't synonyms. They're overlapped in some occasions, but they're not synonyms. When you talked about your part or contribution, there's like 5 quick things that you wrote down. Failure to be vulnerable, the pre-rejection, talk about some people get too open too fast, unrealistic expectations. Some people have uncommunicated expectations. Some people have unhealthy styles of relating. You're in and you're out, you're in and out. Truth is, I told you this pre-podcast, I don't know in some of mine. But there is something, though, as we've been talking, that's really kind of popped out in me, is that uncommunicated expectations, I want to go back to that one real quick, has an assumption in it. And that is we know what our expectations are. And my discovery in my life is that oftentimes I don't know that I expect something, or that people don't know they have expectations until they're not met. Yeah. And in that moment where they're not met, in that moment where those sort of things are going to happen, then we have a choice. We have a choice with the help of the Holy Spirit to dig in more and go, okay, this person didn't meet my expectations that in some cases I didn't even know I had. But there's some basic expectations like honesty. I mean, that no one, but we're talking that the things are unique to you, how God has wired you. Here's one for me. It's difficult for me to be in deep, healthy relationships with people, and I had to learn this. Not that I don't love them, that if they actually think my first name is Pastor and not Brian. There's nothing wrong with that, not at all. But I know what I need from that relationship. If they're looking at me first through what I do as a vocation and not who I am as an individual, it won't be the depth that I personally need. But it took me a long time to realize the expectations that I had and what was healthy and what wasn't unhealthy. Yeah. And so, again, maybe one of the steps to take your faith forward is like, God, I don't even know what expectations I may or may not have. And to sit them down practically. Maybe you have some lists of things that you could flow out on a piece of paper. Say, these are my relational non-negotiables. And then, by the way, once you write them down, doesn't mean they should be your non-negotiables. You should still go back to God and go, should these be my non-negotiables? Right. So I'm not saying that we got it all, but I mean, I think for a lot of us, we do find ourselves in that place. Yeah. Relationships are not working, whatever it might be. And you've got this great list. And I looked at the list, I'm like, there's still some things in my life like, God, I don't know why this happened. And I believe in when his time is right, and his time might be in eternity to come, he'll tell me. Yeah. But I continue to go to him and trust him. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and it is a fun space to start to explore, and fun's maybe the wrong word, but
I was going to say, you said fun. I was like, ooh, yeah, rich. Yeah,
it's
I like that.
Rich, and it's well worth it. And again, you don't have to beat yourself up as you discover these things. But if you can't see yourself clearly, and if you're not willing to allow God to show you yourself clearly, you're just going to keep repeating the same patterns that have led you to these places of pain and self-protection again and again and again. And you're going to miss out on the better thing that Jesus is inviting all of us into. So it's worth it to do this work. It's worth it to discover these things about ourselves so that we can have this thing that Jesus is inviting us into. So first thing to be honest about, past hurts and the effect those have had on you. Second thing to be honest about, your part, your contribution to those past situations. Third thing to be honest about, which again may require God showing you, your need for true community. Because again, large stretches of my life, I didn't get it. I couldn't see it. I was totally blind to it. I was doing the I'm fine. I'm good enough. I have people that talk to me, that engage me as a human being, that recognize my existence here on this planet. I'm fine. Could it be better? Sure, but everything could be better. So, and so we settle. And I frankly, and I said this to my students a lot when I was teaching, and it helped them, I think, sometimes come to terms with something that they couldn't quite get a grasp on. I told them, you're the oldest you've ever been.
Yeah, I loved it when you mentioned that before.
You know the most you've ever known, right? And you can't see everything still to come. You only have perspective backwards. You have zero perspective forwards. And me, as somebody who's, well, when I started, I was 4 years older than them, so about 30 hot seconds. But eventually, I was about 20 years older than them. And so I had a perspective on their life that they were incapable of seeing, not because they're teenagers and they don't pay attention to anything but their phones, but because they're the oldest they've ever been. And so it is for us, right? We just had a conversation as a staff around this topic of community on Monday. And one of the things that came up at my table as we were discussing it was how all of us discovered progressively over time what we thought was good, deep, rich community. Turned out there was more. And then we discovered that and we thought, man, this is fantastic. I never knew it could be this good. And then we discovered there was more. And there was this constant progression of, I thought I knew what true community looked like. I thought I knew what true, deep, transformational relationships looked like. And then I discovered I was wrong, that there was more. And so having to be honest about not only your need for a community, which you probably still don't see clearly, however much you have, but really, frankly, anything around this category. Do you truly see your need for others, their need for you, the effect they have on your life, the effect you have on theirs? Do you see? There's, I think, too many places I want to go with this. So if you've got a thought, jump in.
No, I'll say this because I know we're running up against the window that we usually try to just keep people with us. The word need matters. I think some of us think about community like a backup camera on a car. I remember when I got my first car that had a backup camera, I thought to myself, this is ridiculous. I've spent X amount of years, 30 years, driving without a backup camera. I don't need one. And the truth is, actually, I don't. But it is super nice. I think some of us think community like a backup camera. I don't need it. It's just super nice. If that's how you resonate, and I like to use word picture again, that's the wrong picture. Actually, community is more like the gas pedal. The engine's Jesus, don't get me wrong, but it's the gas pedal. You need that in order to move in the way that God desires, because you're still a car when you're not moving forward. But you're a car not living out your purpose as much. And so there's so many ways, but even when this idea of need comes in, I do think that without even trying, sometimes we think need like convenience. Like it's convenient to have that, but I can still function without it. That is not the call of Scripture. Like you're like, well, I'm functioning now. Yeah, you may be a car that's sitting still. It's still a car. Still a car. So just a way to think about that, because for me, I know that had to be, and still working on a mindset change that I did. I thought about it like the convenience, and it's super nice, and I don't ever want to buy a car without a backup camera anymore. Ever. I don't. It just makes life so much easier. But I can still, at this age, turn my head. Maybe when I'm 70, I won't be able to turn my head, but maybe I won't be driving then either.
No, that's good. And I think that helps bring me back to, I think the things that they're really just questions that I wanted to ask in this space, ask of myself and invite you to consider as well about this need for true community. Are you truly known by anyone? Are you allowing yourself to be truly known by other people? And that includes God. Whose life are you indispensably involved in? And if we just pause it there, we sometimes get an easy out like, well, my kids, because they depend on me. Not what I'm talking about. Whose life are you indispensably involved in relationally? Whose life is fundamentally different because of the ongoing interaction of you in their life, and who gets to do that for you?
Yeah.
And who's committed to your growth? Because we talked about community being a place where you are known, where your story is shown, where it's having an effect, and where you are grown as a result. Who is committed to your growth? Who have you allowed to have influence there? That's one of the places they get to have in your life, is they're there because they help you grow, particularly in your relationship with God, in a way that no one else does. And so then here's the last place to be honest, and we'll wrap up with this. Be honest about, and again, this may require God to show you, where you need to sacrifice for this.
Mm-hmm. Loved your list. First list: time, energy, resources, temperament. At this particular place in my life, and I think, frankly, it's been different at other times in my life. I just circled them for me, like, energy. That's the one. I'm going to have to sacrifice energy for this. It's worth it.
Yeah.
But I've got to say, that's my struggle. And then your other list was fear, pride, control, self-protection. Again, I think depending on where you may have caught me at a particular phase of my life, it could have been one of these, or like E, all the above, A, B, C, D. Right now, though, it is this idea of self-protection, right? Yeah. In self-protection, by the way, no one's wanting us to put ourselves in dangerous situations. Yeah. So by definition, self-protection isn't bad. But I want you to think about self-protection this way. If you think, or I think, I'm better as myself to protect me than God is, that's a bad self-protection.
It is. And that first list may be a whole lot easier to self-identify. Mm-hmm. Still hard to do. It's still hard to make time in this life. I get it. It's still hard to come up with the energy when there's so many demands on it. It's still hard to sacrifice resources when there's so many demands on that. And God knows that trying to be anything other than the way you have become comfortable being with people is hard to do. But that second list is often hard to see, let alone do. To notice the areas where you're operating out of fear and holding yourself back. To notice the areas where you're operating out of pride and holding yourself back. To notice the areas where you're insisting on having things your way and so holding yourself back, or where you're self-protecting.
Yeah.
And so the invitation is to hear all of this as just that, an invitation to go and sit with God and ask him some of those questions. God, help me be honest about the past hurts I've experienced. Help me to see clearly my part in those past situations and circumstances. Help me, show me my real need for community. And show me what needs to be sacrificed and when it needs to be sacrificed and how to sacrifice it and who to sacrifice it for. Right? All of this is meant to, if we go all the way back to the beginning, to come out of our connection with Jesus. Mm-hmm. Not to do this for him, not to do this because he set this as a homework task for us and we have to now go complete it and come back to get graded. We're meant to, through our connection with him, go be connected to others. And so thanks for letting us be connected to you in this way.
Yes.
It truly is a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you for giving us this space for us to work through our own stuff and share the fruit of it with you as we go.
Absolutely. So if you want to talk to us, via email, faithforward@cfcwire.org. You can always call us at the church, 703-729-3900, if that's how you want to do it. If you're around on Sunday morning, John and I are around most Sunday mornings, just grab us. We'll get together. We'd love to do that.
Yep. So until next time.